June 1942, for Japanese aircraft carriers, the absolute pride of the Imperial Navy, are slicing through the Pacific. They are confident, they are unstoppable, and they are convinced that victory is already theirs. But within just 5 minutes, all of that confidence will shatter. 4 decks, packed with fueled and armed aircraft, will erupt into floating infernos. And Japanese commanders, men who believed they understood war better than anyone alive, will watch the impossible unfold before their very eyes. America, the nation they dismissed as inexperienced and slow, is about to deliver a blow so shocking, so complete, that even Japan's top admirals later admitted, "We did not know America." The year is 1942. The Pacific Ocean is vast, silent, and brutal. For 6 long months, Japan has utterly dominated it, sweeping across the western Pacific, seizing territory with alarming speed, and humiliating Allied forces from the Philippines to Malaya. Their navy, the legendary Combined Fleet, is feared across the globe. Led by the brilliant Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, it boasts the finest carrier aviators of the era. Japan's Zero fighters are unmatched in the sky. Their pilots are seasoned veterans, hardened by years of war in China. Their victories have been so overwhelming that many within Imperial headquarters believe the United States lacks the will, and certainly the skill, to ever seriously challenge them. Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of planning and execution. The American fleet lay in ruins. The Philippines collapsed. Guam fell. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in a humiliating defeat. It seemed everything Japan touched in those first few months turned to gold. But beneath the surface of this supposedly unstoppable force, something else was happening. Something Japan did not see. Because thousands of miles away, in dark, windowless rooms filled with radio equipment and cryptographic machines, a small group of U.S. Navy intelligence officers had quietly, painstakingly, cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25, and this single, unseen, silent achievement was about to change everything. Admiral Yamamoto knew the United States was wounded, but not dead. His goal was simple: destroy the remaining U.S. carriers before they could ever regroup and grow strong enough to challenge Japan's dominance. America had 3 precious carriers left in the Pacific: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Japanese plan was to lure them into a decisive final trap. The bait for this trap, a tiny, seemingly insignificant U.S.-controlled atoll named Midway. Midway wasn't much to look at, just a narrow island surrounded by treacherous reefs, with a few runways, some fuel storage tanks, and a small garrison of American Marines. But for Yamamoto it was perfect. By attacking Midway he would force the Americans to respond, and when they did he would crush their carriers once and for all, securing total, uncontested control of the Pacific. But what Yamamoto didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his entire plan, his force structure, and even the exact date of his operation, was already known to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan believed they were the hunters, but they were already the hunted. Admiral Nimitz sat in his Pearl Harbor office, reading the intelligence reports with a quiet, cold focus. The decrypted messages were crystal clear. Japan would strike Midway in early June with a massive force, for fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a whole host of support ships. On paper, Japan vastly outmatched the Americans. They had 4 frontline carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, all of them veterans of Pearl Harbor. They had elite pilots with years of combat experience. They had a much larger surface fleet and all the momentum and confidence in the world. America, on the other hand, had just 3 carriers. One of them, the Yorktown, was barely holding together, having been heavily damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. They had fewer experienced pilots and no battleships to match Japan's naval might. On paper it looked completely hopeless, but Nimitz had something Japan did not: information, preparation, and desperation. He knew exactly where Japan would strike, when they would strike, and roughly what forces they were sending. He didn't need a bigger fleet. He just needed the right moment. Midway would be that moment. But the story of Midway cannot truly begin without acknowledging the forgotten heroes of Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's cryptographic team in Hawaii, led by the eccentric genius Commander Joseph Rochefort. They worked in a world of total secrecy and utter exhaustion. Their desks were covered with intercepted messages, random code groups, and endless, maddening patterns. They suspected Japan's next major target was a location code named AF, but Japan never explicitly said what AF was. So Rochefort devised a clever trick. He had the base on Midway send an unencrypted plaintext message reporting a critical water shortage due to a broken condenser. A few days later, a Japanese intelligence transmission was intercepted. It reported that AF is short on water. That was it. That was the confirmation Nimitz needed. And it was the fatal mistake that doomed Japan. Rochefort's team had effectively handed the Americans the entire map to the battlefield. They knew where Japan's carriers would be. They knew Yamamoto's intricate plan. They even knew about the deceptive tactics the Japanese intended to use. And so, the Americans prepared. On Midway itself, thousands of Marines dug in, stringing barbed wire, reinforcing bunkers, laying sandbags, and mounting anti-aircraft guns. They rehearsed for an attack they knew would be brutal and overwhelming. Pilots trained relentlessly. Mechanics worked around the clock, keeping the island's limited number of aircraft ready to fly. The runways were barely long enough for fully loaded bombers to take off, but the real heart of America's defense lay not on Midway, but in the carriers Nimitz sent to intercept the Japanese fleet, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the miraculously repaired USS Yorktown. Engineers at Pearl Harbor had said the Yorktown needed 3 months of repairs to be complete. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working day and night in the dry dock, somehow, they pulled it off. Patched up but ready to fight, the Yorktown rejoined the fleet, and as the American carriers sailed toward a designated point northeast of Midway, a nervous tension filled every deck. Very few sailors knew the full picture. No one truly knew what was coming, but everyone from the admirals on the bridge to the mechanics deep in the engine rooms sensed its monumental importance. The Japanese, meanwhile, believed their plan was flawless. Their commanders spoke with absolute confidence. Their pilots expected another easy victory, just like all the others. Their intelligence officers assumed American morale was completely crushed after 6 months of relentless defeat. There's an old saying, confidence is often calmest just before disaster, and as dawn approached on June 4, 1942, Japanese lookouts scanned an empty horizon, completely unaware that 3 American carriers were already in position, lying in wait just over that horizon. The trap that Japan had so carefully set for America was about to snap shut on Japan instead. Thank you for watching. If you want to see how this incredible battle unfolds, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Just before dawn on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was deceptively peaceful. A calm sea stretched endlessly in every direction, glittering in the first hints of morning light. But beneath that tranquil surface, thousands of men on both sides braced for a moment that would decide the fate of nations. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commander of the Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force, stood aboard his flagship Akagi, reviewing the morning reports. His 4 carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, and Heryu were the mightiest offensive force in naval history. The aviators aboard them were some of the most experienced pilots in the world, hardened by years of combat from China to the Indian Ocean. The Japanese plan was straightforward. Launch an early morning strike on Midway, neutralize its airfields and defenses, lower the American carriers into the open, destroy them with a second wave, secure Japan's dominance of the Pacific. But Nagumo didn't know that the Americans were not only ready, they were waiting. At 5:53 a.m., Midway's radar operators detected incoming aircraft, dozens of them approaching fast. The call went out immediately. Many bogies heading Midway, bearing 320, altitude 9,000. Marine pilots scrambled. Bombers rolled out onto the runway. Anti-aircraft gunners manned their positions. And on the Japanese carriers, the first wave began to take off. 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 torpedo bombers. A total of 108 aircraft, one of the largest single strikes launched in the early Pacific War. As the roar of engines filled the sky, Japan believed the Americans would still be asleep, unaware, unprepared. But the Japanese were wrong. Unknown to Nagumo, hundreds of miles away, U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol aircraft had already been sent to shadow the Japanese fleet. At 5:34 a.m., one spotted something on the horizon and transmitted the message that electrified every American ship. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 320, distance 180 miles. This was the moment Admiral Nimitz had prepared for. On the American carriers, the order was immediate and unmistakable. Launch everything we have. It was risky. The Japanese fleet was at long range, and U.S. pilots would need to find them in the vast ocean, something that often failed in early war battles. But the Americans had no choice. They had to strike before Japan struck again. And so the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown exploded into motion. The American carriers began their counterstrike. Enterprise Air Group launched first. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, flying his SBD Dauntless, led 33 dive bombers into the sky, climbing toward the clouds and the unknown. Next, Hornet's Air Group took off under Commander Stanhope Ring. But Ring made a crucial navigational decision that would send most of his group on a long, empty flight over open ocean. Finally, from the damaged and hastily repaired Yorktown, a powerful strike group lifted into the air, aiming for the same reported coordinates. Altogether, more than 150 American aircraft were now in the air, scattered, searching, each pilot fully aware that they might never return. Meanwhile, Midway's aircraft Army B-26's Marine SBDs and Navy torpedo bombers launched their own desperate attacks against Nagumo's fleet. But the results were devastatingly one-sided. Poor coordination, outdated planes, and inexperienced pilots led to a slaughter. Torpedo bombers were shredded by Zero fighters. Bombers missed their marks by hundreds of meters. Several aircraft were shot out of the sky before they could even release their payloads. The Japanese formation, drilled to perfection, sliced through the incoming American waves. From the deck of Akagi, Nagumo watched as the Americans threw everything they have and failed. Japanese officers believed this confirmed their assumptions. America was unprepared, outmatched, and desperate. But hidden in this chaos was the first crack in Japan's perception, because while those early attacks did almost no damage, they forced Nagumo to make a decision that would eventually destroy him. This was Nagumo's dilemma, the catastrophic decision. When the first Japanese strike returned from bombing Midway at 7:55 a.m., the pilots reported, "Midway's defenses are not neutralized." This meant a second strike was needed. Nagumo now faced an impossible decision: launch the second wave immediately with the anti-ship weapons already loaded, or rearm the aircraft for another land attack, delaying the strike and leaving his carriers vulnerable. He chose to rearm. Below deck, hundreds of Japanese ordnance crews began frantically switching bombs and torpedoes. Aircraft were moved around. Fuel lines remained open. Bombs were stacked temporarily on the hangar floors. Open fuel hoses, live torpedoes, half-armed aircraft, and bombs scattered everywhere. This was the most dangerous state a carrier could be in. And Nagumo's deck crews were still working when the next threat appeared. At 8:20 a.m., a Japanese scout plane reported something that made Nagumo's blood run cold. "Enemy carriers sighted." That one sentence changed everything. Japan had assumed only Midway-based aircraft were in the area. They were wrong. American carriers, thought to be too far away, were already launching attacks. Nagumo immediately reversed his decision. He ordered the strike force to be rearmed again, switching the bombs back to torpedoes and anti-ship weapons. This caused even more chaos below deck. Fuel lines swung open again. Torpedoes were rolled out. Bombs were moved, stacked, restacked, and switched. The hangars were hotter, more crowded than before. His flagship was now effectively a floating bomb. He had lost the initiative, and he didn't know the worst was yet to come. The first U.S. carrier aircraft to reach the Japanese fleet were the torpedo squadrons from the Hornet, Enterprise, and later Yorktown. These young pilots flew slow, outdated TBD devastators among the most vulnerable planes in World War II. They descended to low altitude to launch torpedoes, making them easy prey for the Zeros. Nearly every aircraft in Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 was shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. Enterprise and Yorktown torpedo bombers faced a similar doom. It looked like a disastrous waste, but this sacrifice changed everything because Japanese Zeros, all of them, dropped low to deal with the torpedo planes. Japan's combat air patrol was now completely out of position, and at that exact moment, from high above the clouds, the American dive bombers finally arrived. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more stories from history. We'll see you in the next one. At 10,000 feet above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey scanned the empty horizon, his eyes burning from hours of flying over endless ocean. His group of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise was supposed to have already found the Japanese fleet, but there was nothing, just blue water stretching to forever. Fuel was running low. His pilots were getting nervous. Some of their planes were dangerously close to the point of no return. McCluskey faced a gut-wrenching decision. He could turn back, save his planes and his men, and live to fight another day. Or he could push forward into the unknown, betting everything on a hunch. What he chose in that moment would determine the outcome of the entire Battle of Midway, and perhaps the course of the Pacific War. Then, at around 9:20 a.m., he saw it. Far below, a tiny speck slicing through the water, leaving a long white wake behind it. It was a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, but it wasn't sailing with the main fleet. It was racing full speed to the northeast. McCluskey instantly understood. The Arashi hadn't just been on patrol. It had been hunting the American submarine Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese force. And now it was rushing to rejoin its fleet. That wake was a road, a signpost pointing directly to the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy. McCluskey banked his Dauntless, pointed its nose toward the Arashi's path, and followed. Minutes later, like ghosts emerging from the morning haze, the impossible appeared. The entire Japanese carrier Forsakagi Kaga and Soyo lay directly beneath him. He had found them, and he had found them at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. Down on those Japanese carriers, it was controlled chaos. Hangars were a deadly maze of bombs on carts, torpedoes stacked in rows, and fuel hoses snaking across the decks. Crews were frantically trying to rearm their planes for a second time, switching from torpedoes back to bombs. Above them, the sky should have been filled with their legendary Zero fighters, but it wasn't. The combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, chasing the last of the American torpedo bombers that had bravely and suicidally attacked minutes earlier. For the first time in the entire war, the Japanese carriers had no high-altitude fighter cover. The sky was wide open, and that's when McCluskey gave the order to attack. At 9:55 a.m., he pushed the stick forward, and his Dauntless tipped over the edge, pointing its nose straight down at the sea. His men followed, a silent, deadly cascade of diving aircraft. Imagine it from the Japanese perspective. One moment, you're on the deck of the most powerful carrier fleet in the world, preparing to launch the strike that will crush the American Navy. The next, the sky is filled with screaming American planes, plummeting towards you like vengeful spirits from a clear blue sky. McCluskey's group mistakenly targeted the Kaga, but in the beautiful, deadly chaos of a dive-bombing run, it didn't matter. The American bombers scattered, attacking multiple carriers. Kaga was enormous, one of Japan's largest carriers, and she filled the bombers' sights perfectly. Air brakes screaming, altimeters spinning wildly, pilots gripping their triggers with white knuckles. Then the bombs fell. The first one crashed through Kaga's flight deck near the rear elevator, detonating among fully armed and fueled planes. The explosion was catastrophic. A second bomb tore into the forward elevator, obliterating the bridge and killing the captain. A third ignited fuel lines. A fourth set off a chain reaction of explosions that ripped the ship apart. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating hellscape of fire, smoke, and twisted metal. Planes on her deck ignited like torches. The heat was so intense, it buckled the steel plates of the flight deck. Kaga was doomed. As McCluskey's squadron savaged Kaga, another group of dauntlesses from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Richard Best, found the Japanese flagship. But then something strange happened. In the confusion, every bomber except for 3 misidentified their targets and veered off. This left Best and his 2 wingmen alone, diving on the most important carrier in the Japanese Navy. 3 planes against a flagship. It sounds impossible, but it was all it took. Best held his dive, waiting for the perfect moment. He released his bomb. It plunged straight through the flight deck, landing squarely in the middle of the hangar deck, packed with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The resulting explosion was devastating, engulfing the hangar in an inferno. A second bomb hit near the stern, jamming the rudder. Admiral Nagumo, commander of the Japanese fleet, could only watch in stunned disbelief as his flagship burned around him. In that moment, he reportedly murmured, "The gods have deserted us." Meanwhile, the dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, arriving separately, found their own target. The carrier saw you. Their attack was brutal and clinically efficient. 3 direct hits smashed onto her deck in quick succession. They landed among planes being prepared for takeoff, igniting a sea of fire. The flames spread so quickly that US captain ordered an immediate evacuation. Within 20 minutes, the carrier that had helped lead the attack on Pearl Harbor was a crippled, burning wreck. Think about that. From the moment the first American bomb hit Kaga to the moment Soryo was consumed by flames, it had taken just 5 minutes. 5 minutes. In that tiny window of time, the course of history was rewritten. 3 of Japan's 4 frontline aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were either sunk or burning uncontrollably. Hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and dozens of Japan's most elite, battle-hardened pilots were lost forever. Years of training and experience vanished in smoke and fire. The Japanese High Command had never imagined this. They never believed American pilots could find them in the vastness of the Pacific. They never believed American dive bombers would press their attacks with such fearless determination. They never ever imagined their proud, invincible carriers could fall so quickly. For the first time since the war began, the Empire of Japan was truly deeply shocked. But the Battle of Midway wasn't over. One Japanese carrier still survived. The Hiryu and her commander, Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, was a man forged in the warrior traditions of the samurai. He was not going to let the Americans escape unpunished. As his sister ships burned, he prepared his own air groups for a counterattack, a strike that would soon land a devastating blow on the American fleet. The Americans had seized the advantage in 5 stunning minutes, but the fight for Midway was far from finished. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. 3 Japanese carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks, their black smoke spiraling into the morning sky. On the American side, pilots were exhausted, low on fuel, and struggling to return to their carriers. But anyone who believed the battle was over didn't understand the sheer resilience and ferocity of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the lone survivor. And on her flight deck, Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi was preparing to strike back. Yamaguchi was everything the Japanese Navy idolized, disciplined, calm under pressure, and fiercely loyal. When he learned that 3 carriers had been lost, his expression did not change. His voice did not rise. He simply said, "We will not retreat." Hiryu's flight deck buzzed with activity. Pilots strapped in. Mechanics fueled an armed aircraft at lightning speed. Torpedo crews raced to load Type 91 torpedoes, considered among the most advanced in the world. Find the American carriers, hit them fast, hit them hard, make the enemy pay. The first Japanese strike group 18 dive bombers escorted by Zeus lifted off Hiryu's deck shortly after 10 a.m. Their target, the American task force now turning into the wind to recover its returning aircraft, and the first carrier they spotted was the USS Yorktown. On the Yorktown, radar picked up the incoming Japanese formation at long range. Instead of panic, a disciplined calm filled the ship. Yorktown had already survived the Coral Sea. Her captain and crew were experienced, efficient, and ready. Fighters for combat air patrol damage control teams took positions. Weapons crews primed their anti-aircraft guns. When the Japanese bombers appeared overhead, they went into steep dives. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns unleashed storm shells, exploding all around the attackers. But Japanese dive bombers were among the best in the world, and several broke through. One tore through the flight deck, one exploded deep inside the ship. Another caused fires and structural shock. Yorktown shuddered violently. Smoke poured from the hangars. Fires erupted across the deck. Crewmen were thrown to the floor. Yet despite the devastation, Yorktown refused to die within minutes. Damage control teams worked with astonishing precision. Fires, extinguished steering, restored engines running. Flight operations ready to resume. Japanese pilots heading back to Hiryu reported the carrier destroyed, but Yorktown was still very much alive. Yamaguchi decided she would have to be sunk. The second Japanese strike torpedoes in the water. Hiryu launched a second wave torpedo bombers. This time, their mission was singular: finish Yorktown. As the torpedo planes approached, American fighters attempted to intercept, but several slipped through. Yorktown maneuvered expertly, trying to dodge the incoming torpedoes, but the Japanese attack was coordinated and deadly. 2 torpedoes struck her port side. Yorktown began listing dangerously. Captain Elliot Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order. Abandoned ship crewmen slid down ropes into the water. Lifeboats were lowered. Destroyers moved in to rescue survivors. The once proud carrier now lay still, leaning sharply, a ghost on the horizon. For the Japanese, it seemed they had evened the score. Yorktown was not dead, and even as she slowly settled, American dive bombers had already launched a counterstrike. The U.S. Navy now had one clear objective: destroy Hiryu and end Japan's offensive capability at Midway. Pilots from Enterprise in Yorktown, those who had landed there earlier, were sent to find Yamaguchi's carrier. It didn't take long. At approximately 4:30 p.m., American aircraft spotted Hiryu sailing alone, her deck busy preparing for another strike, her Zeros climbing to intercept. Richard Best, who had earlier helped destroy Akagi, was among the pilots. A lone shark in an empty sea, Hiryu was about to face the same fate as her sister carriers. SPD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their steep dives, screaming toward the Japanese carrier. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with bursts of deadly shrapnel. Zeros clawed upward to intercept, but nothing could stop the attack, for bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The first smashed through the forward deck. The second ignited the hangar full of refueling aircraft. The third ruptured fuel lines. The fourth detonated near the island structure. Hiryu erupted in towering columns of fire. Her flight deck curled upward from the heat. Flame shot out of hangar openings like breath from a furnace. Crewmen fought the inferno with heartbreaking determination, but the fires were uncontrollable. Yamaguchi knew the truth: Hiryu was lost. He refused evacuation and chose to remain aboard his dying carrier, telling his staff, "I will sink with my men." Moments later, he radioed a final message to the combined fleet: "May the Emperor long live." As night fell, Hiryu burned in silence. Japan's nightmare. The realization sets in for frontline carriers: gone, hundreds of aircraft lost. Their most experienced aircrews wiped out, their offensive momentum shattered. But the most devastating blow was psychological. For the first time since the war began, Japan had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outmatched. The humiliation was immense. Admiral Yamamoto, still miles away with the main fleet, ordered a withdrawal. He hoped to salvage something, anything, from the catastrophe. But his fleet never reached the battlefield in time. Midway was already lost. Yet even as the Japanese retreated, the Americans still faced unanswered questions. Would Yorktown survive? Would the Japanese attempt a counterstrike at night? Would another wave of ships be found in the dark? The battle had taken a decisive turn, but it was not finished. The next hours would cement Midway as a turning point in world history. Night descended slowly over the Pacific. The smoke of burning carriers drifted across the darkening horizon, glowing faintly like dying embers. The sun had set on one of the most catastrophic days in Japanese naval history, but the Battle of Midway was not over. Both fleets were wounded. Both sides had suffered unimaginable losses, but the Americans now held the advantage, and the Japanese were trying to salvage anything they could from catastrophe. Was a single, wounded American carrier, USS Yorktown, and a vast ocean filled with dangers still lurking unseen. Although Yorktown's crew had abandoned ship earlier in the day, the carrier had not sunk. She drifted quietly, listing but still afloat, her internal compartments sealed by experienced engineers who had done everything possible before evacuating. As dawn approached on June 5th, U.S. Navy damage control parties secretly returned to the carrier. Their mission was bold and risky: save Yorktown, stabilize her, tow her to safety. They boarded the silent ship. Fires burned below deck. Smoke lingered in the hangars. The flight deck was torn and twisted, but miraculously, the hull remained intact. By afternoon, salvage crews had righted her list, restored some power, begun towing operations. Yorktown, once written off as lost, was slowly being brought back from the dead. But danger still lurked beneath the waves. The Japanese submarine I-168, the last sting, while the Japanese surface fleet retreated. One threat remained: the submarine I-168, commanded by LTCMDR Jahachi Tanabe. Tanabe received a final, desperate order: locate Yorktown, finish her, strike the Americans a final blow. On June 6, I-168 maneuvered through American destroyer screens with extraordinary stealth. The submarine crept closer and closer to the wounded carrier, evading sonar pings and slipping through blind spots. Then, at 1:30 p.m., Tanabe's crew spotted Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hammond tethered alongside, passing power cables and pumps to keep the carrier afloat. Tanabe ordered torpedoes prepared. The submarine rose to attack depth, and then, in the silence of the deep, Tanabe gave the command, "Fire." The torpedo strikes were torpedoes launched in quick succession. Moments later, a violent explosion tore into Hammond, splitting her in two. The destroyer sank so fast that depth charges on her deck exploded underwater, killing men in the water and shaking Yorktown herself. Two torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's hull. Water poured into new gaps. Bulkheads buckled. The slow, methodical work of the salvage teams was undone in seconds. 1-168 slipped away into the dark ocean. Having delivered Japan's final blow of the Midway operation, Yorktown's fate was sealed. The final moments of Yorktown for hours, the wounded carrier clung to life. But on the morning of June 7th, with her list increasing and internal flooding uncontrollable, she finally rolled gently onto her starboard side and slipped below the waves. As she disappeared, survivors watched in silence, some saluting, some whispering prayers, all of them knowing they had witnessed the end of a ship that had fought with incredible resilience. Yorktown sank with dignity, her loss tragic, but her role in the victory undeniable. Japan's fleet retreats. We must withdraw while American crews battled to save Yorktown. The Japanese High Command grappled with the chilling reality of what had unfolded. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had planned a night counterattack using battleships and cruisers. But after reviewing reconnaissance and assessing the staggering losses, he reversed course. He radioed a message that broke the spirit of the combined fleet: cease operation, withdraw immediately. Japan's dream of crushing American carrier power had become a nightmare. What was supposed to be a trap for the U.S. Navy had instead become the greatest defeat in Imperial Japanese naval history. The silent morning after, on June 7th, the ocean was eerily quiet. The surviving Japanese ships were already racing home. The Americans patrolled cautiously, expecting further contact that never came. The battle was finally over, but the magnitude of what had happened in those few days would take months, years, even for many to fully understand. For Japanese carriers lost 248 aircraft, destroyed hundreds of elite pilots and crew gone. The Japanese offensive halted in its tracks. More importantly, Japan had lost something that could never be rebuilt. Its veteran naval aviation corps, the heart of its carrier striking power. From Pearl Harbor to the fall of the Philippines, Japanese aviators had been unstoppable, but at Midway, in a span of mere hours, those irreplaceable warriors were gone. The empire would never again mount another offensive of the same scale. Historians often describe Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, but to understand why, one must look beyond the simple loss of ships. Midway ended Japan's dominance in the Pacific, shifted the initiative to the Americans, enabled the U.S. to go on the offensive in the Solomons, and beyond forced Japan into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war. Before Midway, Japan dictated where and when battles would be fought. After Midway, America seized that role. The tide had turned permanently. Amid the sweeping strategies and dramatic naval movements, one element stands above all: the human sacrifice. Torpedo Squadron 8 wiped out almost entirely, dive bomber pilots diving through flame and shrapnel, damage control teams fighting to save their ship. Japanese sailors trapped in burning hangars, admirals making decisions that sealed the fate of thousands. The Battle of Midway was not just a tactical victory, it was a testament to courage, discipline, and resilience on both sides. And it was only the beginning of a long and brutal Pacific campaign. But for the first time since the war began, the Allies held the strategic initiative. And Japan's commanders, so confident, so dominant in the early months of the war, were left stunned, shaken, and unsure of what the future now held. The Battle of Midway was over, but its shockwaves were only beginning. For the American sailors standing on the decks of the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown's surviving support ships, the sea was still scattered with oil slicks, debris, and drifting life rafts. The air smelled of burnt aviation fuel, and along those quiet waves floated the remnants of what, just the day before, had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For fleet carriers, dozens of elite pilots, thousands of highly trained crew, gone, Japan had entered the Pacific War with a naval air arm unmatched by any nation on Earth. At Midway, they lost the irreplaceable core of it, but for the Japanese High Command, the shock was still sinking in. Tokyo, initial reports claimed a victory. Newspapers printed headlines celebrating another triumph for the empire, but inside naval headquarters, the truth was unfolding quietly behind closed doors. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway Plan, reportedly stared in silence as casualty reports arrived, first incomplete, then undeniable. His supposedly invincible First Air Fleet had ceased to exist in a single morning. One officer later recalled, "The room was quiet, too quiet, as if everyone understood at the same moment that we had lost more than ships. Japan had lost the initiative, Japan had lost its offensive momentum, and Japan had lost the one resource it could not rebuild fast enough: its veteran carrier pilots." For years, Japanese naval aviators trained in brutal, unforgiving programs where only the best survived. The veterans who attacked Pearl Harbor, bombed Darwin, struck Ceylon, and swept across the Pacific. They were the product of a decade of preparation. Midway erased them in minutes. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the reaction was the opposite. Midway wasn't just a victory, it was a thunderclap across the entire country. The newspapers initially didn't know the full scale. Headlines read things like, U.S. forces win great naval battle, Japanese fleet repulsed. But privately, naval intelligence understood what had truly happened. Admiral Chester Nimitz, after receiving the final battle reports, is said to have leaned back and whispered, "This changes everything." For months, the U.S. had survived the war in the Pacific, retreating, delaying, defending, but Midway flipped the script. America had delivered Japan a wound from which it would never recover. Even President Roosevelt couldn't hide the significance. Though he downplayed specifics to avoid revealing intelligence capabilities, he told close advisors, "This is the turning of the tide." And yet, here is the part most people don't know. America's victory at Midway was shockingly close to collapsing. Had even one of these variables changed, the outcome might have been drastically different. 1. If the American torpedo squadrons hadn't drawn Japanese fighters downward, then the dive bombers would have been intercepted and massacred before ever reaching the carriers. 2. If a Japanese scout plane hadn't launched late, they would have spotted the U.S. carriers early and struck first. 3. If Nagumo had armed his planes 5 minutes faster, Akagi and Kaga might have launched a full strike before the dive bombers arrived. 4. If Wade McCluskey had anti-spotted that single Japanese destroyer turning at high speed toward the task force, he would have missed the enemy fleet entirely. These tiny decisions in the chaos of battle made the difference between victory and catastrophe. Historians agree on something remarkable. Midway wasn't just a battle of strength. It was a battle of timing, luck, courage, and human judgment, all happening at once. One surviving Japanese sailor later said, "Had the Americans arrived moments later, we would have struck them first." At Midway, seconds decided the fate of empires. From that day forward, Japan's strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. The U.S. went on the offensive at Guadalcanal just 2 months later. New American carriers rolled off the docks in an industrial surge Japan could not match. Japan's carrier forces never again fielded the experience, skill, or coordination they had in 1941, 1942. Midway didn't end the war, but it set Japan on a long, irreversible decline. The tide had turned permanently. For the American sailors who survived Midway, the victory came with a bitter cost. Hundreds were lost, and the USS Yorktown, already damaged at Coral Sea, finally sank after valiant efforts to save her. For the Japanese survivors, Midway was a memory of flames, sinking decks, and friends lost at sea. Many veterans later described it as the moment they knew the war could not be won. Even Admiral Yamamoto is believed to have said privately, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Midway was the moment that realization became unavoidable. If you enjoyed this deep, dramatic retelling of one of history's most pivotal battles, if you want more World War II stories, lost archives, forgotten confrontations, and shocking turning points, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who loves history. More unbelievable World War II stories are on the way, and, trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.